Hello everyone, welcome in. This is section 2.3, Space 3 Perspective Techniques, in Mogoon's Coloso class, Fundamentals of Stylized Character Art. And then quick notice, you can always keep updated on this playlist series as a whole by subscribing, or by just keeping tabs on the playlist as videos come out and I post them to the playlist. So jumping right into the notes. It was mainly just learning the actual practical application for everything we learned in the previous section of basic perspective. So really he just kind of goes over tips and tricks that he uses in order to better apply perspective techniques that we've already learned. So we'll go over those here in a fair bit. So the first thing he really goes over is learning how to measure in perspective, and then after that he kind of goes over a little bit of some tips and tricks in regards to measuring perspective. So measuring relative to the perspective is important, using a relative standard, either using the angle or the length of lines. So this is the basis of most of his measurement within perspective. It's always something that's already drawn into perspective that he knows as a concrete standard, and then using that standard he'll draw elsewhere. So an example of this would be like if you have a perfect cube in your illustration, which isn't often, but it might be the case. That perfect cube drawn in perspective can then be used to measure angles and lengths standard using the cube itself. And then use objects of equal size or angles as reference to compare to the human ratio. So say you have this figure illustration that has a cube in the illustration as we mentioned in the prior example, and that cube is about the same size as the figure's head, then you can then use that as a measurement of the figure's head, which can then be relative to other proportions of the figure as well. So everything is a relative standard, just so long as the baseline of it is within perspective and fits. So finally, some techniques in measuring perspective. You can find the center, which is to draw the diagonals if you're using a square in this example, and you can find their intersection point, and no matter the perspective, that intersection point is going to be the center on that face. You can divide into thirds, which again, using the same square example, if we were to draw diagonals from the vertices to the midpoints of the furthermost side and the opposite vertices, the intersecting line between those points will mark a third. You can draw that third within a square. Again, these are within a perfect square example, which isn't often, but it does show up, and they're just good back pocket tricks to know. You can draw an equal length, which by doing so, you can draw a perfect shape like a square, and then use the midpoints or measurable lengths of the shape to extend past the figure and draw the same length further in perspective. So a good example is like a railroad track. So you could draw like a square inside of the railroad track in perspective, and then you could extend that length so you could see what that would look like in perspective and measure that out to be accurate within the perspective. And then finally, dividing. You can draw a line that intersects from the point in perspective, then divide into as many divisions needed that intersect the initial line and meet the perspective lines. And then from there, the intersection point of the perspective from the divisions drawn from the baseline will draw a vertical division within the perspective itself. So this one's kind of a lot harder to describe without a visual illustration, so hopefully I'll have one up here pretty soon. But it's really just an easier way to create perfect divisions within a perspective, which it's not often you'd want to use a technique like this. So it's not too dire of straits to have a perfect division within perspective, but it is another good tool to have just in case you're drawing something a little bit more rigid and uniform. And then like mentioned, these techniques aren't often used except for really precise backgrounds, so like cityscapes and stuff, or objects, things like robots where they kind of have like hard angles and set proportions and stuff. So keep that in mind, these aren't concrete by any means. It helps to draw a guiding line in the perspective using the transform tool in order to get an estimation of the vanishing point, which can then be used as an intuitive guide for further objects in perspective. So this would kind of be like a step up if you're looking to avoid some of the more obnoxious and drawn out techniques used to draw accurately in perspective. So a good example of this is to like draw a vertical line, and then you can use the transform tool to distort the line into perspective, and then from there that line can then be your guide of perspective for all the objects and the figures within your illustration around it. You can get a pretty close accurate representation that will save you a lot more time. If drawn properly in perspective, the object won't look strange when horizontally flipped and compared to the perspective. This is something you really should be doing anyways, because generally you start getting used to how the illustration looks while you're composing it, and you might be overlooking some glaring details that you really won't see until the illustration is horizontally flipped, and you can kind of see if there's asymmetry or elements that look okay and oriented one way but completely strange the other. And it's good to have harmonious elements, however horizontally flipped it is. So it's important that you're horizontally flipping your canvas and making sure everything looks good on either side when you're drawing, which will also act as a double check for making sure everything's in perspective. And then it's generally easier to make a separate layer for each object since it's easy to merge layers but difficult to separate them, and clients generally prefer many layers where appropriate. So this is generally just kind of like a miscellaneous tip that Mogoon offers, which is to beware of whatever layers you're working with and what you're drawing on. For those who work digitally, I'm sure you understand the pain of doing line art on a sketch layer or vice versa, or anything else where you're messing on the wrong layer, and then it's super difficult to kind of go back on that work without losing a ton of progress. So make sure you know and you're keeping aware of the layers that you're working on, as well as keeping them separated from each other. And it'll actually help in the professional world where you can show a lot of your progress to potential clients, as well as if they have different changes that they want to whatever work that you're proposing. And you can separate the work out into different layers if they want a different outfit, different hair for the character, etc., etc. So this was a pretty quick class. As a quick summary, knowing techniques to measure objects in perspective will help create consistent objects in them. Perspective doesn't need to be perfect, but generally needs to be accurate, and intuition and perspective will grow, so detailed steps can gradually be omitted for drawing accurately in perspective. Again, this is the moving from these techniques in perspective to just drawing lines and transforming it, then to just being able to draw in perspective without really needing a lot of guidelines and premeditated work done. And then creating an accurate base and perspective will help make further steps in the illustration much easier. Again, this is create a gold standard that's in perspective, and then from there you can measure everything else out to be accurate as well. And then the self-assigned homework that I thought was appropriate is from the sketches in 1.3 that we did all the way down here. Pick one or two of them and redraw the composition into a 3-point perspective, and add at least one object into perspective that you can draw. This is mainly a recommendation from Mogoon. He kind of mentions it at the end of the lecture, but he really recommends following along and drawing in the same sort of project that he exemplifies in his background that he's doing, that we saw started in 1.3 if you're following along in the Coloso class. But for those who don't know, he pretty much showed an initial sketch in 1.3 that went over the topics that we had mentioned in that video, which will be linked down in the description if you guys need to go back and check out that review. But pretty much we're taking those sketches and he's redrawing the sketch in better perspective, and then going over the sketch so that the elements that he's drawing are in perspective, and then he can draw on top of them and refine them. So that's really what we're doing with the sketches that we had already done in the self-assigned homework of 1.3. So that was section 2.3. Thank you guys so much for joining in to this class review. Remember that you can always keep on top of further class updates, any other content of mine, etc., on my socials. I will link them around here so that you guys can check them out if that would interest you guys. As well as if you have any questions, you can feel free to leave them in the comments or leave them on my socials as well. I'm more than happy to answer where I can. Again, thank you guys so much for joining in on section 2.3. We're actually starting section 3 on the next class, so super exciting stuff. We'll be able to get into a lot more of the figure drawing within perspective and really building up our illustrations over time. So looking forward to that, and hopefully I'll see you guys in the next lecture review with that. I hope you guys have a good day. Make sure to take it easy. Bye-bye.